Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories. I suddenly awoke, drenched in cold sweat. The nightmare must have returned, but I couldn't quite remember it. Talking to the doctor had helped, but I knew that trying to fall back asleep would just bring the nightmare again. I glanced at the clock. It was 5:15 a.m., almost time to wake up anyway. I decided to get dressed. Running a ranch meant early mornings and long days, but I loved every minute of it. I owned 600,000 acres of rolling hills near the Sierra Nevada, with my nearest neighbor 50 miles away in any direction. I'm certain of that because it's how far you have to go to reach the property lines from the ranch house. I headed to the bathroom, shaved, showered, and went back to my room to get dressed. Once ready, I looked every bit the typical cowboy. At 42, my hair had mostly turned gray, and my weight had dropped from 250 to 200 pounds due to all the hard work on the ranch. My face had taken on a weathered look from years of sun and wind. Some women I'd dated called me ruggedly handsome. I no longer looked like the man who arrived from the Southwest a decade ago. In fact, I didn't even look much like my Irish roots anymore, but I was still alone. I just couldn't bring myself to get close to any of the available women around. That's not to say I didn't enjoy going into town. I did, but I never met anyone I wanted to take things further with. One of my ranch hands once told me, if you wake up with the same woman you saw a week ago, it's time to head into town, so I followed his advice. As I got older, though, the time between trips into town grew longer, but I suppose that happens to everyone. I made some coffee and brought a cup into my office, planning to start my day a little earlier. I switched on the TV and tuned in to a national news channel. I love having my satellite dish. It lets me stay connected to the outside world while enjoying rural life. My guests would probably go into withdrawal without it. This was a working ranch with herds of beef cattle, and we bred horses, sheep, and even a buffalo or two. About 5 years after moving here, a small family drove up my driveway, towing a travel trailer. They asked if they could camp on my land, and I appreciated that they asked because most people would just set up without permission. Usually I'd have to send one of my hands to ask them to leave. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe it was because they asked, or maybe it was the hope I saw in the boys' eyes, or maybe it was just because I had a good breakfast that morning. Whatever the reason, I sent one of the hands to help them find a spot by the stream, under the trees, but close enough to the ranch to have access to water, electricity, and bathrooms. That evening there was a knock at my door, and there stood the boy holding a massive plate of cookies. He thanked me for letting them stay on my land and told me how much they liked it here. I noticed his father standing nearby, flashlight in hand, clearly proud. The boy said his mum made the best cookies in the world and pointed out his favorites. I raised my voice so the dad could hear, thanked the boy, and invited them both in for some milk and cookies. We had a great time. That little boy got me thinking about my own children, whom I hadn't seen in a long time since I left without saying goodbye. The next morning I was working with some horses in a corral near the main barn when I noticed the father and son watching. I was due for a break, so I rode over to the fence. The boy instantly reached out to pet the horse I was riding, but it was a mean stallion, prone to biting anyone who got close. I yelled for him not to touch, and he pulled back, tearing up a little. I hadn't meant to scare him, so I got off the horse, knelt down, and explained that I didn't want him to get hurt because the horse was a biter. Afterward, the boy hugged me. Feeling bad, I took him into the barn and showed him a newborn foal we hadn't let outside yet. She was incredibly gentle, so I let him into the stall. He bombarded me with questions about the foal and her mother. I guess I made a friend for life because, for the rest of the week, the boy was always right there beside me. The father apologized for his son's behavior, but I told him it was no problem. I actually enjoyed the company. As the week went on, I grew close to the boy. He was about the same age as my own son, whom I hadn't seen in years. I didn't realize it, but the boy was filling a gap I hadn't known I had. By the time they left, all the ranch hands were sad to see the little family go. That fall, I decided to start a family-oriented dude ranch. I already had 6 cabins with electricity and running water, so all I needed to do was clean them up, add water heaters, and make some minor adjustments. My main house was huge. The dining room could seat 30 people, and the living room was just as large. I also had a library filled with Western history books. We figured out the rest as we went along. I placed a small ad in a vacation magazine for families back in the Southwest. I received a few replies and some deposits. Not a huge start, but it was something. As the arrival date for our first guests approached, I called a staff meeting. We decided on activities for the guests, which horses they could safely ride, and what chores they could help with. We even outfitted an old wagon as a chuck wagon and planned to take them on an overnight trail ride to give them an authentic Old West experience. Over time, business picked up, and after a few years, we were fully booked all summer long. Having families around made the ranch feel alive. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, I reflected on how I'd ended up here. It had been a long, winding road. I used to work as a bookkeeper for my Uncle Frank in a small office above one of his restaurants. You might not think being a bookkeeper is an important job, but my uncle was the head of one of the biggest crime families on the West Coast. I managed all his money, both the legal earnings and the rest. I was respected in the family. One day, a small kitchen fire forced us to evacuate the building, so I went home early. When I got there, I noticed the garage was open, so I parked inside and walked through the side door. The house was eerily quiet. Then, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. Without thinking, I grabbed my son's baseball bat from where he'd left it by the door and headed upstairs to investigate. I quietly crept upstairs and entered my bedroom, where all the noise was coming from. The sight that met me is something I'll never forget. My wife was with another man. She didn't even notice me enter. I started walking toward them when her lover turned his head and saw me. He looked straight at me and smirked. It was Nick Russo, an enemy from a rival crime family. His smirk told me everything I needed to know. He was with my wife to humiliate me. After that, everything became a blur. When my rage finally subsided, I saw Frank lying on the bed, his head bashed in. I guess a 270-pound man with a baseball bat could do some serious damage. He was dead. My wife was on the floor, and it looked like I had hit her too, but she was still alive. Unsure of what to do next, I called my cousin. He told me to calm down, get in my car, and drive over to one of his businesses where he'd take care of everything. When I arrived, I was placed in a car and driven 250 to 300 miles west. We swapped cars and continued driving for 2 days. Eventually, we stopped at a small motel outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, where we stayed for a few days while I cleared my head. My handler told me that a crew had been sent by my cousin to clean up. Frank's body had disappeared, and my wife had been thrown down the grand staircase in the foyer to make it look like she had fallen. The crew then set fire to the bedroom to eliminate any evidence of Frank's death. The fire department later found my wife at the bottom of the stairs and assumed she had fallen while trying to escape the fire. The truth was, when I hit her with the bat, I broke her back. The rough treatment she received afterwards severed her spinal cord at the injury site. She was paralyzed from the waist down, losing the use of both legs and control over her bladder and bowels. I felt no pity for her after what she had done to our marriage. One of her doctors suspected her injuries weren't caused by a simple fall down the stairs and wanted to investigate further. But soon after he bought a new cabin cruiser, he lost interest, likely due to a conversation with some of my cousin's associates. My 2 children were staying with my elderly parents and were doing fine. They had been told that their mother had a boyfriend who injured her, and they accepted this explanation since they had overheard phone calls between her and Frank. They never asked to visit her in the hospital. My handler then delivered the final blow. Frank had a distant cousin who was the don of another crime family, and now there was a bounty on my head. I could never return home or see my children again. On my last day in Las Vegas, my handler handed me a new briefcase. Inside were all the essentials I needed to become Ryan Blake. Tom O'Connor no longer existed, and the life I once had was over. I was given Western-style clothes and introduced to another ranch hand. We got into his truck, and I left to begin my new life. I snapped back to the present and started my day. It was Friday, and all the guests scheduled for the next 2 weeks were due to arrive that morning. I walked into my office, flipped on the welcome sign, powered up my computer, and got ready for another Friday. Around noon, a limo pulled up in front of the office. I was outside at the time, and my first thought was that these guests would be high maintenance. Most who arrived by limo were. The back door opened, and 2 teenage kids stepped out. My next thought was that these were 2 spoiled kids without their parents, and their stay wouldn't last long. I even considered starting a bet with the ranch hands on how long it would take for them to want to go home. They stood around as their luggage was unloaded, and I thought they looked familiar, but before I could dwell on it, current guests interrupted me with questions. By the time I finished, one of my helpers had already checked them in. At dinner that night, I gave my usual speech about the ranch, what we expected from guests and what they could expect from us. I reminded them that this was a working ranch, not a resort where every whim was catered to. If they were hoping for spa treatments, they'd be disappointed, but I assured them we'd do everything to make their stay unforgettable. I noticed the two teenagers had found some peers from another family and seemed to be getting along. I might have to revise my prediction about how long they'd stay. Since this was a working ranch, I spent most of my time managing things. The ranch hands who worked with our Dude Ranch guests had to be outgoing, and they were. The guests loved them, and if the hands weren't explaining something, they were entertaining them with tall tales. About a week later, I heard some noise coming from one of the smaller barns where we stored hay and grain for the horses. I went to check it out and found one of the teenage boys fooling around with one of the girls. While I understood teenage hormones, I had to stop it, so I cleared my throat loudly. They weren't having sex, but they were close. I had been a teenager once, so I knew where they were coming from, but I also felt like I was playing the role of a parent. I gave the boy a stern look and said, "Get going." Boy, I almost laughed when he ran for the door, bent over at the waist. Then I turned to the girl, told her to finish getting dressed, and meet me in the study in the main house. We were going to have a talk. As I walked out of the barn, I tried to figure out how to handle the situation. I'd never raised children, let alone a teenage girl. By the time I reached the house, I had decided to take the responsible adult approach. About 10 minutes later, she came into the study, still crying. I pointed to a chair across from me and asked if she wanted something to drink. I grabbed a soda for myself as she shook her head no. Trying to keep my voice calm and gentle, I imagined what I'd want someone to say to my own daughter if the roles were reversed. I talked to her for about 30 minutes, probably getting a little carried away. I was right in the middle of giving her a speech about saving yourself for someone you truly love when she suddenly looked up, studying my face closely. Then she said, "You've got my grandmother's eyes and grandpa's voice and mannerisms." Tears started streaming down her face as she asked, "Are you my dad, Ryan O'Connor?" I looked at her young face and saw my ex-wife's eyes staring back at me. I remembered a little girl gazing up at me with those same eyes, holding out her arms to be picked up. I looked at her and said, "I've missed you, Mia." The next thing I knew, my daughter was sitting on my lap, hugging me tightly, both of us crying with happiness. This was the little girl I never thought I'd see again, now grown into a beautiful young woman. For the next hour, we talked about everything. Eventually, the conversation turned to my son. She asked me not to say anything to him yet. She wanted to talk to him first, and she promised to do so that evening after dinner. For the rest of the day, I was completely useless, overwhelmed with emotions. I wandered around the ranch with my head in the clouds and a big, goofy grin on my face. My ranch hands couldn't figure out what was going on with me since they knew I hadn't been to town recently and was keeping my distance from the guests. That evening I was sitting in my office, trying to focus on some paperwork, when suddenly a 16-year-old whirlwind burst through the door, shouting, "You're my dad." Before I knew it, we were standing in the middle of the office, hugging each other like our lives depended on it. Alex had grown into someone I was incredibly proud of. The next morning, I grabbed a special cell phone, saddled up a horse, and rode out into the hills to make a private call to my Uncle Frank. His son answered, and I greeted him with, "Hey, cuz." After a brief pause, he replied, "Hi, cubby," with a smile in his voice. Suddenly, we were both talking at the same time, like two excited kids. Once we calmed down enough to have a proper conversation, I told him about my kids and asked why they had been put in danger by being sent out to see me. My cousin explained that it had been his father's decision and passed the phone to Uncle Frank. My uncle came on the line, sounding old and weary, but there was genuine joy in his voice as he spoke. He told me that Don Victor had passed away, leaving no one to manage his empire, so the council divided it, with the largest share going to Uncle Frank. He had lifted the bounty on my head, and it was now safe for me to return home. I thanked him but told him I was settled here and couldn't just leave everything behind. However, I promised to come home for Christmas and stay through the new year. I also expressed my gratitude for the gift of my children, explaining that they would remain with me until they needed to return to school if they chose to go. As I was heading back to the main house, the phone rang again. It was my cousin, informing me that my uncle's health was deteriorating and that these might be his last holidays with us. He explained that Uncle Frank had terminal cancer. I assured him that I would be there for the holidays. That night, I had my housekeeper open 2 of the extra bedrooms in the main house. I only used the master suite, and the other 6 bedrooms had been closed up. The next day, while my kids were out playing rancher, I had their belongings moved into their new rooms. They came running into my office later, yelling that someone had stolen their things. I just smiled and pointed to the 2nd floor, telling them, "You guys moved." They disappeared upstairs to check out their new rooms, and after a lot of noise from the 2nd floor, they came back down, asking why I had gone through the trouble of moving their stuff when they were supposed to head back east next weekend. "That's what you think," I said, then explained my phone call with Uncle Frank and told them that if they wanted, they could stay until school started. There were 2 very happy teenagers in that room. They said the rooms were amazing but wanted a few things from town to make them their own. I tried to object, but it was 2 against 1, so I relented and told them they could take one of the pickups into town the next day. Watching them head into town, I began to have second thoughts about letting them take the truck. I could already picture the back of it piled high with stuff when they returned. The truck wasn't completely full, but it was clear they had given it their best effort. I was told to stay out of their rooms until they had a chance to fix them up. I didn't see much of them for the next couple of days as they stayed busy decorating. When the big reveal finally came, I was led upstairs after promising not to peek and made to close my eyes. When I opened them, each room had typical teenage decorations. My son's room was covered with posters of his favorite athletes, a few car posters, and somehow he even managed to sneak a swimsuit poster into the mix. His sister gave it a disapproving glance and muttered something under her breath that sounded like 34. I kept quiet. I didn't see what she had to complain about. Honestly, I kind of liked the poster. When we reached her room, the feminine touch was unmistakable. It was clearly a young woman's room. As I looked around, I noticed a large framed photo of me on her nightstand, just like the one in her brother's room. Her desk also had a framed picture of me. As I gazed at the photos, I realized they had all been taken here on the ranch. Both my son and daughter had told me they wanted my face to be the first thing they saw in the morning and the last thing at night. A lump formed in my throat as I realized how much time I had lost with them. Over the following months, we had many conversations, talking about everything that had happened in the 13 years I was absent from their lives. One night, after we had run out of things to discuss, they asked about their mother and why I left. I had dreaded this moment from the day we were reunited, but I knew I had to be honest with them. I told them about that day, the fire that caused me to leave work early, finding their mother with her lover, the rage that consumed me, and how, when I came to, I had killed her boyfriend with a baseball bat and hurt her as well. I explained how I had regretted that moment of violence ever since. I talked about calling my cousin and how he had taken over from there, eventually giving me the briefcase with my new identity and telling me I could never return. My son looked at me and said, "I'm glad she went crazy and ended up in a mental hospital. I never want to see her again after what she did my daughter," on the other hand, just sat there, looking sad. I made a mental note to ask my uncle about my ex-wife when I visited to find out what had really happened to her. Deep down, I realized I needed closure. I still missed her and had to know why things had ended the way they did. Summer ended far too soon for all of us. The kids and I knew it would be nearly 3 months before we could see each other again. We promised to call and email, but it wasn't the same as seeing their faces across the table or in the room every day. As much as I hate to admit it, those 3 months felt like years. When the time finally came, my entire crew took me to the airport to send me off. They knew most of the story about my divorce and the time I'd spent away from my kids. What they didn't know was the truth about the violence or my connections to organized crime. I returned home earlier than expected, arriving back east ahead of schedule. I had told everyone I'd be there on Friday, the day before Christmas, but I was actually a week early. My ranch crew couldn't handle seeing me so downcast, so they moved everything up and practically dragged me to the airport. There I was, pressing the intercom button at the gate where the cab had dropped me off. A gruff voice answered with, "Yeah." I asked if my cousin was home, and the response was, "Maybe." I told them, "Tell him Ryan's here," and within 2 minutes, my cousin was running out the front door, yelling for the gate to be opened. The guards must have thought we were insane, standing in the driveway hugging and cursing each other with a lot of colorful language. Then, my kids joined in the hugging, and by that time, my cousin and I had cleaned up our language. As I looked up, I saw my uncle in the doorway, sitting in a wheelchair, being pushed by a nurse. He looked like a shadow of the man he once was. I disentangled myself from the family and walked over to him, wrapping my arms around him, saying, "It's good to be home. Thank you for making this possible." When I looked at his face, I saw tears forming in his eyes. So I whispered, "Tough guys don't cry, so I was right, you were always a chicken." His face lit up with a smile, and he whispered back, "Don't let my secret out." Later, when we were alone, my cousin commented that it was the best his father had looked in months. He didn't ask what I'd whispered to his dad, but he thanked me for making him a bit happier. We celebrated Christmas with every relative and family member there. Nearly 400 people crowded into the house. My cousin thanked everyone for coming and spoke about the year ahead. When the microphone was passed to my uncle, he said a few words about how much family meant to him. All the men stood and raised a toast to him, while everyone else applauded. I knew he was moved, though as a hardened man, he couldn't show it. I walked over to him and reached for his hand to say something, but he pulled it back and said into the mic, "I don't hold hands." The room erupted in laughter. There was nothing left to do but follow tradition, so I kissed him on both cheeks. When I finished, I saw him smiling from ear to ear, clearly having gotten the best of me. On Christmas, we kept things small, just immediate family, as my uncle was too frail for anything extravagant. New Year's Day was spent in the hospital, watching him slowly lose his battle with cancer. He passed away in his sleep on February 8th, peacefully leaving us behind. I hoped he had finally reunited with his wife, who had died 7 years earlier. When we arrived at the funeral home a few days later, I was amazed. The entire place was dedicated to his service, filled with flowers, and the line of people waiting to pay their respects stretched around the block. Since it was January and cold outside, the people in line were given hot drinks and small warm sandwiches. Whoever organized that thought of everything. On the day of his burial, his service was held in the largest church in the area. But the bishop himself conducted the funeral mass, and the graveside service was just as full. The church overflowed with people, and the same was true at the cemetery. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched his casket being lowered into the ground next to his wife. They were together again. My kids stood beside me through all of this, their eyes constantly filled with tears. For most of their lives, my uncle had acted as a second father to them after their grandparents passed away. Though they had me back in their lives now, they would deeply miss the man who had filled that fatherly role for so many years. After the funeral, my daughter seemed down for several days. When I finally asked her what was wrong, she responded with a single question, "Can we visit Mom?" I had hoped I'd never have to see my ex again. The last memory I had of her was when I caught her with my enemy, and even after 12 years, that memory was still vivid. I swallowed hard and told my daughter I'd make the arrangements. I asked my son if he wanted to come along. "Hell no," was his reply. "I never want to see that 300-pound whore again." I made a mental note to get him some help to work through his issues. A few weeks later, my daughter and I pulled into a state-run institution. My cousin had informed me that my uncle had refused to pay for my ex-wife's care, blaming her for all of my problems. She had been declared a ward of the state and was housed in a public hospital without receiving proper treatment. We were directed to her doctor's office inside the facility, and after a long wait, we were led in. The doctor, an Asian man who spoke broken English, sat behind a desk with her patient file in front of him. There was another stack of files on his desk, nearly 18 inches high. I asked if all of those were his patients, and he said yes, explaining they were short-staffed. My daughter began asking questions about her mother, and as I listened, I realized the doctor had no idea who she was. I asked him directly, "Does my wife still go for her daily runs?" He confidently responded. Of course, I squeezed my daughter's hand tightly so she wouldn't explode. You see, her mother had been paralyzed from the waist down for 12 years. Running wasn't something she could do. I asked if we could visit her on the ward. The doctor called for an orderly, and we were taken to her section. When we met the head nurse, she was kind and seemed familiar with my ex's case. She explained that my ex-wife had withdrawn completely and hadn't spoken a word in nearly 12 years. She had developed paranoia and shut herself off from the world. The nurse led us to the day room, where my ex-wife sat. She had once been a beautiful woman, standing 5'8" and weighing around 120 pounds. When she entered a room, everyone used to turn their heads to look at her, but that was over a decade ago. Now, She weighed around 300 pounds, had greasy, unwashed hair, and was confined to a wheelchair. Her face had the vacant, distant look often seen in the mentally ill. My daughter approached her and began speaking, but it was clear that none of it was registering. My heart broke for my daughter. She was trying so hard, hoping her mother would recognize her. As I moved toward them to offer support, my ex-wife's eyes locked onto mine. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition before she erupted into screams, thrashing her arms wildly. 2 orderlies quickly restrained her, and the nurse administered a sedative. Whatever was in that shot knocked her out immediately. The duty nurse told me it was the first time in 5 years that she had reacted to anything. She took down our information and promised to contact me if there were any changes in her condition. We left that dreadful place in the car, heading back to my uncle's estate. On the way, my daughter broke down and cried uncontrollably. I promised her I'd look into transferring her mother to a private care facility closer to the ranch. Yeah, I was soft like that, wanting to make sure my daughter could visit her mum and ensure she got the care she needed. Once we returned to the ranch, I started my search. I found a facility about 120 miles away that had a solid reputation in the mental health field. I visited the place and liked what I saw. The doctors and staff were professional and genuinely caring toward their patients. I had a long talk with the head doctor, the same one who had helped me control my nightmares many years ago. We discussed my wife's condition, including her first outburst in at least 5 years when she saw me. Although he didn't like her violent reaction, it showed that she was somewhat aware of her surroundings, which he found promising. We arranged for her transfer to his care, and I called my daughter to share the good news. She cried again, but this time from relief. A couple of months passed when the doctor reached out, asking if I could send him a photo of my face. I asked why, and he said he'd explain later, so I sent him an 8x10 photo, one that my kids had taken while visiting colleges. Between college visits for my daughter and moving the kids to the ranch, I had completely forgotten about the picture and my ex-wife. That's why I was caught off guard when her doctor called again and asked if we could meet in person at my ranch. We scheduled a time, and he came on a beautiful spring day. Since he liked to ride, we decided to head out to one of my high meadows to enjoy the view. We made small talk on the way out, but once we arrived, we dismounted and sat down in the grass. The doctor told me they were making progress with my ex. Her weight had dropped by about 90 pounds, and she was losing it quickly. She had even started to take an interest in her appearance again, asking the nurses to brush her hair. Of course, she still wasn't speaking, but she would point to a brush when she wanted her hair done. Then he dropped a bombshell on me. Whenever my ex was shown a picture of me, she would scream, "He's going to kill me too," and go into a frenzy. They usually had to sedate her to calm her down. The doctor wanted to know if her fear of me was justified. Then he just sat there, waiting for me to respond. I thought carefully before deciding to tell him everything. I asked if what I said would be covered by doctor-patient privilege, and he told me to give him $1, making me his patient. I handed him the money, and then I started explaining. I told him I was raised in an organized crime family, with my uncle as the Don. I was his trusted bookkeeper, and I knew everything about the business, where the money came from, where it went, and who was getting bribes, from cops to judges and politicians. My wife was well aware of my job. I explained how I came home early one day and found her in bed with her lover. I wasn't all that upset with her. I could have just divorced her, but her lover was my enemy, and when he saw me, he smiled like he was mocking me. His look told me my wife meant nothing to him, that he was only using her to humiliate me. That's when I snapped. I found a baseball bat in my hand and began beating him in the face. By the time I came out of my rage, he was dead, his head completely destroyed. My wife was unconscious on the floor, but still breathing, with signs that she had also been hit by the bat, though I didn't remember striking her. I told the doctor how my cousin had arranged the cleanup. They made my wife's lover's body disappear, threw her down a staircase to make it look like she had fallen, and then set the bedroom on fire to cover up the evidence. The house was almost entirely destroyed by the flames. The doctor sat silently for a long time, thinking. When he finally spoke, he said my blind rage was understandable, and that my brain had likely blocked the memory of the event as a defense mechanism to protect me from the horror of what I'd done. He then asked if that was the only time I had ever used violence against someone, and if I had experienced nightmares or blackouts since then. I explained that my uncle had made me the family's bookkeeper precisely because I wasn't cut out for violence. My uncle always called me the gentleman. I had never hurt another person, and I didn't recall having nightmares about hurting anyone. Still, every once in a while I would wake up screaming. The doctor suggested that I had probably buried the incident so deeply in my subconscious that it wasn't affecting me in my daily life. Normally, he would try to bring such memories to the surface so I could deal with them, but in my case he advised leaving it buried. He did, however, give me a list of symptoms to watch for, and made me promise to call him if any of them appeared. I then brought up my son's intense hatred toward his mother and asked for advice. The doctor suggested I bring my son in to see him sometime so they could talk. He said he would help my son work through his anger. We left the meadow, both of us deep in thought. Once we returned to the house, he asked me to keep my distance from my ex-wife until he advised otherwise. He also encouraged my daughter to visit her mother frequently, saying it would be beneficial for both of them. At that time, my daughter was in her junior year, studying pre-med. She had her heart set on becoming a psychiatrist, though she knew it would take many years of study. She told me that seeing how a skilled doctor had helped her mother had inspired her decision. My son, a freshman, was studying agriculture with plans to eventually join me in running the ranch. As time went on, I started noticing that every conversation with my daughter included a mention of Bill. It seemed like all I heard about was Bill this and Bill that. I wasn't the most clueless dad in the world, so I suggested she invite him over for Christmas dinner to meet the family. I wanted to make sure he was good enough for my little girl. About an hour later, I received a call asking if we could set an extra place for Christmas dinner and if Bill could stay in one of our spare rooms for the week, as his parents were heading to Europe for the holidays. I wasn't naive, so I agreed. When Bill and my daughter arrived, I was pleasantly surprised. Bill was a well-mannered, polite young man. He stood about 6 and weighed around 190 pounds. He had sandy hair and brown eyes. Like my daughter, he was a pre-med major, but his goal was to become a surgeon. My daughter said he was cute, but as a man I'd never looked at another guy and thought, "He's cute, that's just not how I'm wired." Regardless, I liked him and thought he was a great match for my daughter. I also couldn't help but notice they were practically glued to each other for the next 2 weeks. Much to the amusement of my ranch hands, they took to calling me Gramps and joked about needing to borrow money for a wedding reception. You get the idea. By Valentine's Day, they were engaged, and an August wedding date was set. Soon enough, I found myself standing in the foyer of a local church, anxiously waiting for the bride to arrive. As my nerves built up, the priest leaned over and whispered, "They're always late. Don't worry, she'll show." And she did. While walking her down the aisle, I noticed a wheelchair near the first pew on the bride's side and my friend, the psychiatrist, sitting next to a woman in the front row. I was so focused on walking my daughter that I didn't give them much thought. After I handed my daughter off at the altar, I turned to take my seat and was stunned to find myself looking into my ex-wife's eyes. My daughter must have sensed my reaction because she squeezed my arm and whispered, "It's okay, Daddy." I invited her. I sat down next to my ex, expecting her to start screaming at any moment, but my friend, the shrink, just gave me a reassuring smile, as if to say, "It's fine. She'll behave, just don't get too close." When the priest finally declared them husband and wife, I felt my eyes fill with tears. I glanced over at my ex and saw that she, too, was crying. As the newlyweds turned to walk back down the aisle, I started to step across my ex to avoid blocking her view, but her doctor grabbed my arm and shook his head, whispering, "Don't touch her, she's not that strong yet." I paused, then joined the procession out of the church. I didn't see my ex again that day. Later, at the reception, as I danced with my daughter, she mentioned how far her mum had come. I thought about my own feelings toward my ex and realized I, too, had come a long way. Some of the anger I had harbored over the years had faded. I was even proud of her for all the progress she'd made. I made a mental note to call her doctor the following week and set up a golf date. We needed to talk. The next week, during our golf game, we discussed my ex-wife's improvement. I praised him for the work he had done with her. He reminded me that she was still very fragile and that even a simple touch from me could undo years of progress. However, the fact that she had attended the wedding and sat beside me was a major step forward. Curious, I asked how he had managed to get her to accept me. He explained that it all started with the 8x10 photo of me he had requested years ago. At first, he placed the picture on a shelf in his office, almost out of her sight. Once she stopped reacting violently to it, he gradually moved it closer. After about a year, he was able to place it on his desk without causing her distress. He then began to gently discuss her feelings toward me, emphasizing that a picture of me couldn't hurt her. One day, during a session, she finally had a breakthrough. She started talking about the day everything fell apart. She remembered being with Frank and feeling him pull her over his head, as if trying to shield himself. Then, she felt an excruciating pain in her back and realized something had hit her hard. She recalled Frank pushing her to the floor, the pain in her back becoming unbearable before she blacked out. The next thing she remembered was me checking if she was still alive, then leaving her there in agony. After that, she remembered being thrown down the stairs. When she regained consciousness, she was being carried out of the house by a firefighter, coughing from the smoke. The terrible pain in her back had vanished, but she could no longer feel her legs. The doctor told her that was likely when her spinal cord was damaged, leading to her paralysis. He also shared my side of the story with her. After their conversation, he brought her back to her room to process all the new information. A few days later, my daughter asked if her mother could join us for Christmas dinner. I agreed, as long as it was okay with her doctor. I called him the next day, and while he was a bit hesitant, I suggested that he and his wife join us as well, and bring my ex. He thought that would be a better arrangement and agreed to it. On Christmas Day, the three of them arrived about an hour before dinner. My ex was wheeled into the living room, where everyone had gathered. At first she seemed overwhelmed by all the people, but eventually she calmed down and even joined in a few conversations. As for me, I made sure to stay out of her sight and avoided any conversation she was part of. One didn't want to increase her stress. When it was time for dinner, I was asked to give the blessing. I kept it simple, asking God to bless everyone there and wishing for a good year ahead. I especially prayed for the newlyweds and for my ex to find healing. While I spoke, I glanced over at her and saw her shyly smiling at me. Her doctor gave me an approving nod. My daughter started crying, and my son just sat there, shocked. No one else at the table knew the significance of that small prayer. Afterward, we enjoyed a typical Christmas feast, mixed with an Italian spread that could have fed a small country. By the time we finished, I was so full I could barely move. We gathered in the living room for coffee and after dinner drinks. I was lounging in my chair, resting my eyes, when I sensed someone next to me. I peeked through my half-closed eyelids and saw my ex staring at my outstretched hand, as if she wanted to touch it. I stayed perfectly still. After a moment, I felt a very light touch on my hand, but it quickly withdrew. I kept pretending nothing had happened. A few more moments passed, and I felt her hand touch mine again, this time firmer and for longer. Then I heard the sound of her wheelchair moving away. When I opened my eyes, I saw her doctor holding her hands and speaking softly to her. Later, I found out he was telling her, "See, now you know he won't bite," just as he had reassured her many times before. He also mentioned to her that he believed there was still a place for her in my heart. I suppose I agreed. Later, when they were leaving, she looked over at me and mouthed thank you. The following week, I had a conference call with her doctor and my daughter, and we all agreed she was strong enough to spend Christmas Eve and Christmas Day at my house. The doctor and his wife had already booked a cruise, so they couldn't be there. But he put my daughter in charge of her mother. He advised me to keep things low-key and to avoid initiating contact with my ex. He said to let her make the first move. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, I was on edge. I was certain that I would do something wrong, upset her, and ruin Christmas for everyone. I decided to spend as much time as I could in one of the barns or out inspecting the property. As I was walking between two of the buildings, I suddenly heard my ex calling my name, waving me over. I walked toward her and sat on one of the porch chairs, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. She wheeled her chair closer and gently said, "Please don't be afraid of me. I know now that you never intended to hurt me all those years ago, and I'd like to see if we can be friends again. Doc Hoy and I have talked a lot about this." I started to stand, but the look of fear in her eyes made me quickly sit back down. Overcome with emotion, I felt tears start to stream down my face. As if out of nowhere, she pulled out a tissue and reached over to dry my eyes. She softly whispered that it was okay and asked again if we could be friends. I nodded in agreement. I also noticed my daughter and son watching the whole interaction from a distance, both looking pleased. Later that night, I somehow ended up alone with my ex. She needed to be carried upstairs to her bed, and I offered to find a couple of women to help her. She shook her head and asked if I would do it myself, saying there was no need to disturb anyone else. I walked over and bent down to lift her, feeling her arms wrap around my neck, not just for safety, but like a hug. As I carried her up the stairs, I realized she had her head buried in my chest, as though she was trying to catch my scent. When I set her down on the bed in the guest room, I could tell she wasn't ready to let go, so I stood there until she finally released me. Afterward, I went to retrieve her wheelchair. When I returned, she asked me to put her back in the chair and wait while she got ready for bed. About 10 minutes later, she reappeared with her hair tied up, her face washed, and dressed in a simple nightgown that covered her completely. I had turned down her bed while she was in the bathroom, so I helped her into it and tucked her in. I leaned down to kiss her goodnight, but she quickly turned her head, so I only managed to kiss her cheek. I immediately thought I had overstepped, but little did I know, there was another reason for her turning away. The next morning, when I woke up, I had the distinct feeling that at some point during the night, she had wheeled herself into my room and sat watching me. I brushed it off as a dream caused by everything that had happened. After getting dressed, I walked into the hallway and found her sitting at the top of the stairs, waiting for someone to help her down. When she saw me, she held out her arms and said, "Please." I carried her down to the kitchen, where everyone had gathered. The room fell silent as I set her down. I went back upstairs to get her wheelchair and made sure she was comfortable. Later, we gathered around the Christmas tree to exchange presents. It was a typical family Christmas, our first in almost 15 years. At one point, I noticed my ex surrounded by piles of gifts, quietly crying. I started to get up, but my daughter beat me to it, walking over to her mother and saying, "Mum, we've got 15 years of gifts to make up for, so buck up and start opening them." My ex broke into a wide smile and resumed unwrapping her presents. At dinner that evening, as we were discussing plans for New Year's Eve, my ex suddenly interrupted and asked, almost to no one in particular, if she could spend the holiday with us. Without thinking, I blurted out that she was already included in our plans and added that she could stay for the entire week unless she wanted to return to the hospital. She wheeled herself over to me, wrapped me in a big hug, and whispered, "Thank you." We had a wonderful week together and an amazing New Year's celebration. She stayed with me until everyone else returned to their lives, and it was just the two of us left at the ranch. We agreed that she would return to the hospital after one more night. Late that evening, I woke up to find her sitting in her wheelchair in my room. A storm was raging outside, and the power had gone out. She told me her room was cold and asked if she could sleep in my bed. I don't remember saying yes, but suddenly she was beside me. As I started to put my arms around her, she quickly laid out some ground rules. Rule 1, no sex, she couldn't feel anything anyway. Rule 2, no kissing or displays of affection. Rule 3, holding her and cuddling were allowed and very much wanted. So I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close. She rested her head on my chest and softly sighed, saying, "I've missed your smell. It's the scent of a real man." We spent the night cuddling and talking. The next morning, it was still snowing heavily, making it impossible to leave. I suddenly realized that her helpless act had been just that, an act. She moved between her wheelchair and the furniture as if she wasn't even disabled. When I confronted her about it, she admitted that all she really wanted was to feel my arms around her. Later that afternoon, her doctor called, and they spoke for about 2 hours. I overheard parts of the conversation. In all the years we were married, I had never heard her speak so openly. She had never shared like that with me. Eventually, she called me to the phone, and her doctor praised her, saying it was the best he had ever seen her. However, he also mentioned that she still needed to return to the hospital. She wasn't ready for a full return to normal life just yet. He added that she had one more issue to resolve. When I later called to ask about it, the doctor told me she would explain it when she was ready. Typical doctor response. About 2 weeks before Easter, I received a call from the hospital, and I was shocked to hear my ex's voice on the other end. She asked if the family was planning to celebrate Easter at the ranch and if she could attend, as she had something she wanted to share with all of us. I agreed to pick her up from the hospital a few days before the rest of the family was set to arrive, as she wanted to share her news with me first. I assumed she had come to terms with whatever issue she was facing and was ready to share it with her family. Her voice sounded weak and a bit unsteady, but I thought that was just due to the emotional conversation. Later, her doctor called and spoke with me privately, telling me that the past 4 months had been extremely hard on her and that I would be shocked by her appearance. He explained that what she had gone through was necessary. I picked her up 3 days before the kids were due to arrive. Her face looked tired and worn, as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was spring, and the wildflowers were blooming in the pastures, with the trees sprouting fresh leaves. This time of year had always been my favorite, a time of renewal. I wheeled her chair around, pointing out the beauty around us, and we spent a wonderful afternoon together. It was as if all the years we had been apart melted away. That night, as I carried her to bed, she asked if she could sleep next to me because she missed being held. At some point during the night, she woke me up. When I tried to stop her, she quietly pleaded, "Please, I need to do this for you." I noticed she was using protection she had never needed before, but I was too tired to question it. She was crying, and when I tried to pull her close, she resisted, reminding me of Rule 2, no kissing. Then she began to tell me her story. She explained how Frank had first seduced her using drugs, and after a few times he had gained complete control over her. The doctors later told her she had suffered from mental health issues her entire life, and Frank had exploited these vulnerabilities to manipulate her. She became as dependent on him as an addict on drugs. She continued, recounting the night I found them together. She had no idea I was there until Frank used her as a shield to block my blows with the baseball bat. She described the sudden, excruciating pain in her back when I hit Frank, followed by him pushing her to the floor. Though she knew I was attacking him, she was in too much pain to move and passed out, waking only when a fireman carried her out of the burning house. She had thought I was trying to kill her. When she woke in the hospital days later, they told her that her back was broken and she would never walk again. It was shortly after that when she spiraled into the madness that consumed her for the next 12 years. She explained that her doctor had told her how my daughter and I had saved her from the neglect at the state institution by moving her into his care. He helped her realize that I hadn't tried to kill her and that, despite everything, I still loved her. Then she hit me with the worst news. Frank, or one of his associates, had left her with a parting gift, HIV. Because of the poor care she received and her long period of mental instability, her HIV had progressed to full-blown AIDS before it was even diagnosed. There was nothing the doctors could do except keep her comfortable. She wouldn't live to see another Christmas. Now, it was my turn to cry, and I held her as tightly as I could all night long. The rest of the family learned the truth after dinner on the Saturday before Easter. The following morning, we all went to Mass together, seeking God's help to get through this. She passed away in October. She had requested to be cremated and wanted her ashes scattered beneath a large oak tree at the hospital, where she and her doctor had held many of the talks that helped pull her out of the darkness. It was a special place for her. The next spring, I had a marble bench installed there, with a plaque bearing her name, dates, and the words, "The world was a little better while she was here." I began visiting the hospital monthly to play golf with her doctor, David. Over the years, we had become close friends, often spending hours together at the 19th hole after our games. David's wife would always scold us, insisting I stay the night instead of driving home. On my way back, I'd stop by the hospital, sit on the bench, and update my wife on everything the family had been up to. I missed her deeply, and there was an emptiness in my heart that only she had filled. I realized I had always loved her. The bench became a popular spot for families visiting their loved ones at the hospital. Eventually, a landscaper added a small stone patio with a walkway, making it accessible for wheelchairs. Soon flower beds were added, and later a small pond with goldfish. I knew my ex would have loved it. One day, while we were sitting there, my daughter and son-in-law told her and me that we were going to be grandparents the following spring. I don't know if my ex could hear, but I was grinning from ear to ear. A few years later, I got a call from my son, who was in his final year of college. He asked if he could bring a friend home to the ranch for Christmas, mentioning that his buddy was studying to be a veterinarian and would love to see our operation. It was the first time he'd ever asked to bring someone home, so of course I said yes. The week before Christmas, I saw my black Eufy pulling up the driveway, my pride and joy. Let me tell you a quick story about that truck. About 3 months earlier, I had opened the garage where I kept the SUV, only to find my son's subcompact car there instead, and my truck missing. In the car was a note: "Needed extra cargo space. Took your truck. Love, Ethan." After grumbling around the ranch all day and making everyone's life miserable, I eventually calmed down, remembering how bad the gas mileage was on the SUV. I figured my son had outsmarted himself. Then I remembered I kept a gas credit card in the glove compartment. Oh well, he was my only son. Back to the present, when the SUV pulled up, my son hopped out. The passenger door opened and his friend stepped out. I was stunned. Standing there was one of the most beautiful redheads I had ever seen. She stood about 5 and took my son's hand as they walked toward me. As my son introduced her, I found myself looking into her bright green eyes. I thought, why doesn't the vet I use look this good? Over the next few days, I learned more about her. She was an only child, living with her divorced mother in a neighboring state. Her father had left her mother for a 22-year-old dancer, taking every penny they had and moving to a small island in the South Pacific. They left behind only debts, forcing her mother to declare bankruptcy and move them into a tiny apartment in a rough neighborhood. Her mother found work as a receptionist or billing clerk for a doctor, which covered their expenses but left little for anything extra. Her mother had taken a nighttime job as a waitress at a nice restaurant to help make ends meet so that Ella could go to college. Ella was a straight-A student and had earned a scholarship to my son's college, but she still had to work as a waitress at a local diner for spending money. Even with all that, she managed to maintain a 3.8 GPA. She was smart and hard-working, and I was proud she had let my son into her life. I also noticed they were rarely more than a few feet apart, like someone had sewn Velcro onto their clothes. The two of them spent their Christmas break checking out all the livestock on the ranch. Since they were usually out from sunrise to sunset, I figured they were taking advantage of the alone time that comes when parents aren't around. Imagine my surprise when they started reporting back on which animals and pastures needed extra attention. By the time they left, Ella had an open invitation to spend her Christmas breaks with us. In fact, I was happy to have her visit whenever she wanted. I even realized I was saving money. I figured out what my regular vet would have charged and sent her the equivalent in cash. Cash, you ask? I figured she'd tear up a check, but it's much harder to destroy real money. A few days after Ella and my son returned to school, I got a phone call from him. Ella wanted to spend the holidays with us, but that would mean leaving her mother alone for the first time since she was born. Ella was unsure of what to do. For me, it was an easy decision. Her mother could come too. It wasn't like we didn't have the space, and if she didn't want to stay in the main house, we had several guest houses from the Dude Ranch part of our operation. A week later, I got the okay from my son, and after a few more phone calls, the dates were set. I arranged for her mother to have a first-class round-trip ticket to an airport near the college, all at my expense. That way she could ride to the ranch with my son and Ella, and I wouldn't have to entertain her before the kids arrived. It seemed like a win-win situation. As the arrival day approached, I found myself standing outside the main house, watching the driveway more than I'd care to admit. I was eager to see the kids again. Besides my son and Ella, my daughter and her family were also set to arrive around the same time. My daughter, her husband Bill, and their baby Amanda actually showed up about 5 minutes before my son. We were still standing in the driveway when the SUV pulled in. My daughter and her husband walked over to greet my son and meet Ella, while I made my way over a little slower, as I was carrying my granddaughter. Ella and my son hopped out of the front seat, and when the back door opened, I couldn't believe my eyes. Stepping out was an older version of Ella, her mother. She had the kind of beauty that only comes with maturity. I just stood there, staring, until my daughter walked over, took Amanda from me, and whispered, "Dad, shut your mouth. It's hanging open, and you're embarrassing us." Regaining my composure, I went over to welcome Ella's mother. I was introduced to Olivia, a woman with stunning red hair, green eyes, and a figure that took my breath away. I was so awestruck that I could barely string 2 words together. She greeted me with a bright smile that lit up her whole face. My daughter handed Olivia the baby, probably because she didn't trust me not to drop my granddaughter at that moment. The 2 weeks they spent with us flew by. I took Olivia on tours of the ranch. She had owned a horse before her divorce and was an excellent rider, so I set her up with a gentle mare, and we rode together across my land. She loved the scenery and all the animals. As we rode, we talked about our lives and families, and by the time she had to leave, I felt like I knew more about her than most couples know about each other after decades of marriage. We chatted like old friends. After everyone left, I felt a bit lonely, Even though I had 15 ranch hands around me, I found myself counting the days until spring break when the kids would return. Olivia had said she probably wouldn't be able to get time off for the visit, but I had other plans. Without telling her, I called the doctor she worked for. We worked out a deal where I'd cover her salary for 2 weeks, plus the cost of a temp to replace her. I also called my cousin to borrow his private plane, who says crime doesn't pay. When the time came for her to fly out, I called and told her that travel plans had changed. She would need to bring her luggage to work because a car would pick her up and take her to the airport. Sure enough, a chauffeur showed up at her office, took her bags, and escorted her to a stretch limo. As the limo drove away, her co-workers stood at the door with their mouths hanging open. She called me, thanking me, as the limo pulled up next to my cousin's Gulfstream jet. The chauffeur introduced her to the pilot and helped her board the plane. I could still hear her on the phone, softly sobbing. I waited until the signal cut out before hanging up. I think she was impressed. I had an airstrip on my property, thanks to my cousin, who once complained about the 3 to 4 hour drive from the nearest airport that could handle his jet. We found a good spot for a runway, and within a few months, I had a 10,000-foot airstrip complete with a hangar. That's where I was sitting in my truck when her plane landed. Olivia stepped out, bombarding me with a million questions. I promised to explain everything after dinner. That evening we were alone in my study, a small fire crackling in the fireplace as we sipped brandy. I told her about my upbringing in one of the largest crime families on the West Coast, though I had never been involved in the business itself. I just reaped the benefits. She asked me a few questions, more to gauge my morals than to learn about my family. I must have answered correctly because she walked over, sat next to me on the couch, and rested her head on my shoulder. We stayed like that until we couldn't keep our eyes open and went to our separate rooms. The next morning she was back to her usual self. At Easter dinner, I once again managed to stick my foot in my mouth. I asked my son if he had taken Ella to visit his mother at the hospital. I heard Olivia drop her fork, and when I looked at her, I gave her a glance that said, "We'll talk later." My son explained that he felt it was more important to bring Ella home to meet me and Olivia before introducing her to his mother. I must have passed the test because I could tell from Olivia's expression that she agreed with his decision. After dinner, I sat down with Olivia and told her the entire story about my ex-wife and why she was in the hospital. She listened intently, not interrupting once. When I finished, she softly asked if she could meet her someday. I promised that I'd arrange it if she really wanted to. The next few days felt like we were on a family vacation rather than just spending time with friends. My daughter and her family stayed in the main house because of the baby, while Ella, my son, and Olivia stayed in the guest cottages. My daughter and I made sure that the kids never had the opportunity to spend time alone in the main house. I didn't want to be put in a position where I had to explain too many things to my granddaughter once she started talking. The week seemed to fly by. One moment they had all arrived, and the next they were gone. Olivia flew back to her job, and I wasn't sure when I'd see her again. She mentioned possibly taking some time off around the 4th of July, so I hoped she could visit then. The waiting was tough. I felt like a teenager going on his first date. It had been a long time since I felt this way about someone. After she left, I found myself calling her office twice a week, but it got so bad that I had to limit myself to once a week just to stay productive. If my ranch hands hadn't been so good at running things, I might have gone out of business. When the 4th of July finally came, we had an amazing time. I even took her to the local fireworks display, where she shared memories of the last time she had seen fireworks. We talked about visiting her old hometown and seeing her mother, who was still alive. Ella and my son joined us for the festivities, and I was having the time of my life. One evening, while Olivia and I were sitting in the living room talking about nothing in particular, she suddenly blurted out that she was falling for me and that it scared her. I sat there, grinning like an idiot, knowing I should say something but unsure of what to do. I asked if she wanted to talk about it, which only seemed to make her angry. So, I tried a different approach, telling her how much I had looked forward to her visit and how much I loved seeing her in the kitchen each morning, at the dinner table, and just being around her. Maybe I'm a romantic old fool, but that's how I felt. When the weekend ended and Olivia flew back home, I felt empty again. She didn't call for a couple of weeks, explaining later that she needed time to think about us. I felt like a teenager waiting for his prom date to say yes. It wasn't a fun feeling. Finally, she called and apologized for the delay. I told her I understood and nervously asked what she had decided. I was scared of what her answer might be because I realized how much I would miss her. To my relief, she said she wanted to continue our relationship and see where it might go, though she wanted to take things slowly because her divorce had been messy. I told her I was fine with that, and she made plans to visit over Labor Day weekend. We started seeing each other again, taking things at a careful pace. When Labor Day came around, she showed up with Ella, which was when I found out that the two of them had been talking regularly. My son kept giving me knowing looks and muttering sucker. Under his breath, I figured they were up to something. That evening, Olivia and I were sitting on the porch, looking up at the stars and sipping brandy, when she said, "I think it's time we make our relationship more official." That's how it all began. At Christmas, I got down on one knee and proposed. She said yes, and we planned to get married the following August. Now, I have to start planning for another wedding at the ranch. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the unexpected turns and heartfelt moments in this story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more engaging stories. Stay tuned for the next one.